it's my honor, my pleasure indeed, to introduce the good Dr. Josef Sorett. I met this man 14 years ago. I should say more. I'm Lyndon Gill, professor of African and African Diaspora Studies and Anthropology here at UT. And long before I was any of that, I was a struggling little graduate student, and I met this man 14 years ago. It's hard to believe, when I was 10. And I've admired his combination of heart, mind, and swag ever since that moment I first laid eyes on the very serious face, light-skinned brother in the bow tie that I learned so much from way back in the day. And he's really been a formative example of what it means to survive graduate school and survive graduate school with style and also sensitivity. And so I'm thankful that we can have Josef here today. I was grateful that we shared a program, and now that we share a degree from a small, obscure college in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm grateful that he's out here against all of my own best efforts, making a Harvard PhD in African and African American Studies look so damn fierce. Thank you. I try to do the opposite, but you always come through, Josef. I appreciate you for that. Dr. Sorett is an associate professor of religion and African American Studies at Columbia University. He also directs the Center on African American Religion, Sexual Politics, and Social Justice. Dr. Sorett's masterful first book, Spirit in the Dark, A Religious History of Racial Aesthetics, the spirit of which we will visit us today, hopefully, just a little bit, was published by Oxford University Press in 2016. This work easily secures his place as a formidable interdisciplinary scholar of religion, literature, and race in the Americas. He is currently editing an anthology daringly entitled The Sexual Politics of Black Churches, which we need desperately, so I'm excited for it. And his forthcoming book is tentatively titled The Holy Holy Black, Ironies of African American Secular. Ironies of an African American Secular, which is also under contract with Oxford University Press. He makes it look easy. It's not easy. He just makes it look easy. Dr. Sorett's scholarship has been published in a respected array of academic journals and anthologies. His writing has appeared in a range of popular media, news media, among them the Huffington Post, the Washington Post, and the New York Times, and he's been a sought-after commentator for NPR, ABC News, and the BBC in his spare time. The phenomenon. Please join me in welcoming the good Reverend Dr. Josef Sorett.
Good afternoon. Thank Lyndon for that warm introduction. We should all be so lucky to have Lyndon introduce us once at least. I didn't realize it was 14 years that we met while in graduate school, so it's a pleasure. Lyndon also came up as part of the work that's leading to the edited volume on sexual politics, gave a dynamic presentation at Columbia on spiritual Baptist women in Trinidad. I'm excited to see his book soon, right? So thank you, Lyndon, for the introduction. Thank you, Professor McNally, for the invitation. Thank you all for coming out for this conversation on my first book, Spirit in the Dark, Religious History of Racial Aesthetics. So I'm going to use this PowerPoint. My knowledge of AV support and supplies is relatively rudimentary, so there will be nothing fancy here, but some images to walk us through what will hopefully be a conversation about the book, but also a conversation even more so about the ideas that the book was trying to wrestle with. So just to give you a sense, what I want to do to organize, I guess, the next 30 or so minutes. I have two different introductions, one more personal, one more academic. Lay out just a couple ideas about the core arguments of what I'm trying to get at in the book, and then cover what was roughly a decade of research in the 20 minutes or so that's left by hopefully overwhelming you with some images and examples organized around the 7 chapters in the book to think about the religious history that the book is trying to narrate. So the first introduction begins, I guess, roughly 20 years ago in Boston, Massachusetts. And this was even before I began the PhD and was beginning to have an interest in religion and literature. I was working, in fact, at a church, hence the Reverend in Lyndon's wonderful introduction, working with young people at a church, teenagers, and sometimes their younger siblings, And often on Wednesday night, we'd be having a group conversation that may or may not have engaged the Christian Bible. And then often that would end at around 7 o'clock. It's good to see Nicole Burrows as well, sorry. To see some older friends as well out here. And often after this Bible study conversation with the young folk at Charles Street AME Church in Roxbury, I would skip across town to a venue called Estelle's, a nightclub in Roxbury, South End. Nobody is uncomfortable with the move from church to the nightclub. Often there's a little nervous laughter there. So I would head over to Estelle's for an event, which at the time was the largest spoken word gathering in Boston's robust black literary scene. This was right around the time that Poetry Jam was taking off in the mid to late 90s. And on one particular night, I think it was actually 1998, so that's about 18, 19 years ago, a black Hebrew Israelite, a member of Boston's black Hebrew Israelite community, part of this incredibly diverse black religious landscape, black Judaism in particular, came to the mic. And as I had just maybe an hour prior to that left the church, his title caught me off guard, or caught my attention very quickly. His title simply, "For All You Church-Going Black Folk." And he got up, dressed in white, and conjured what we tend to think of as the sort of quintessential claim of someone like Malcolm X out of the 1960s, right? But with his own fresh take on how Christianity was the white man's religion, right? And so not only was I working at a church at the time, I was also wrestling with some theological questions. I had graduated from L.Warfield University a couple years before that, and was at Boston University School of Theology. It wasn't an incredibly powerful performance, but it engaged me where I was. And I didn't quite realize how much, but roughly 8 hours later, around 4 o'clock in the morning, I found myself awake and banging at the computer. At the time, I also harbored some literary aspirations. Right? Maybe I had stepped in front of an open mic myself. And I, for about 30, 45 minutes, banged a poem that I titled, I was later told by a colleague that it was less a poem and more a screed. It was called Unapologetically Church. Right? I was trying to think on more complicated terms of the role of the church I played in my own life, the role that church had played in African American life more broadly, certainly acknowledging its role as a tool of oppression, but also the more complicated ways in which black life had been shaped by and through cultural and religious tradition that we think of in association with the black church. Now, I've never recited that poem in public, and I won't, and as I told you in light of some of the feedback, the one thing that it did clarify was that I was not on my way to Def Poetry Jam. No invitations from Russell Simmons or Mos Def were forthcoming. Unlike Linda, who had quite a powerful spoken word performance. But jokes aside, the project began, instead of taking me on this literary journey, a cluster of more theoretical and historical questions about the relationship between churches and nightclubs, which later I would realize was in fact a long-standing trope within African American literature. We think of Sunday saints and Saturday night sinners, and then which gradually took the form of both the first book that's out and the second book that seek to think across the disciplinary divisions between history and literature and religious studies and black studies, but across the lines of sacred and secular, right? And so what the project does is try to narrate a history of ideas about black religion by engaging with black writers, many of whom are in fact the usual suspects of the African American literary tradition, many of whom you'll see in a moment. So it brings history and literature together in a way that is sort of common within American studies programs, but then also is organized as much around the historical narrative and the literary sources with a cluster of questions around, namely, what is religion? What is it we're talking about when we think about religion? And here, as I was in a Black Studies program, in an African American Studies program, what also struck me was the ways in which the sort of secularist orthodoxies of literature departments also seem to abide often within Black studies. And here I think of language of intersectionality, something that's a very critical vocabulary in Black studies, out of the field of critical race studies, we are very adept in thinking in sophisticated ways about the way in which race comes up against class, comes up against gender, comes up against disability, comes up against sexuality as these markers of social difference. But then it seems to me that often the way in which we think about religion, there's not the same degree of sophistication, right? The way in which religion, as much as it's a set of beliefs and practices, way of connecting with the divine being in certain instances, we often, beyond the critique of Christianity as a white man's religion, don't take as nuanced attention to the ways in which religion is a marker of social difference. And so the ways in which I was in some ways aspiring to add religion to Kimberly Crenshaw's formula of thinking about these linked identities and experiences in the term intersectionality. So the project tries to bring my own experience moving between Black studies and religious studies by attending to literary sources to tell a different sort of history of Black literature. And the key argument here in this regard within religious studies is it seemed to me that there was often in this effort to counter Christianity as this hegemonic and oppressive religious force, a very quick move, an effort to move outside of a Christian hegemony in a way that didn't acknowledge even the move, reinscribe the relationship between the center and the margins, right? And so while acknowledging this Christian hegemony, account for the ways in which Black writers, Black intellectuals think through and with Christianity, not even as a tool of conversion, but also as a set of organizing categories and concepts for engaging with Blackness in the world. So one of the things I'm trying to do is think through Christian hegemony, through and against at the same time. And second, making an argument about these sources that have typically been cast as secular by recasting them, by attending to the ways in which they write about religion, in particular paying attention to how a grammar of spirit emerges in these debates around Black art and culture from roughly 1920 to 1970. So what the book is doing in each of these moments across the span of about 5 decades is looking at the ways in which the terminology of spirit alongside spiritual or spirits or spirituality, sort of robust language around spirit, changes across time and space and gives us a sense of a genealogy of spirit that is used to theorize Blackness in the broadest sense, but also to create the boundaries for a Black literary tradition. And then, as I mentioned earlier, to sort of engage with studies of literature, both Black literature in particular and American literature more broadly, in the way in sort of theoretical debate that since 2008 forward, in the aftermath of Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, has turned into its own academic cottage industry, now known as secularism studies. And so these are the things I'm trying to wrestle with to make a fundamental claim about the ways in which Afro-modernity is made in many ways in the image of the Black church. So I'll talk a little bit more about this. And hence the title of the book, which for those of you who have not read it, I'm sure most of you, how many of you recognize the title of the book? Well, now, no, it's not there, I didn't show it yet. How many of you recognize the title before I tell you what it is? Right? So at least just one, all right, excellent. So I'm of course borrowing from the most famous daughter of the preacher man, Aretha Franklin, her 1970 album. And for me, this song, while a literal performance of Black church, also is an apt metaphor for thinking of Afro-modernity more broadly. So I'm only going to give you a teaser, and there's always a danger when playing Aretha that people would prefer her Aretha than you, including myself, but I'm going to give you a teaser. This is Aretha performing live at Fillmore West. We won't watch the whole thing, but halfway through she brings Ray Charles to the stage. And of course there's the common adage that all great Black musicians come out of the church, at least that was for some time, persists even in recent years with folks like Fantasia and others, the way in which a Black church aesthetic pervades Black secular music. But nobody embodied this more, and this song is emblematic of the ways in which the aesthetics of the church persist, even in that most secular of space, the nightclub. So here's Aretha live in Fillmore. Whoop, wrong button.
In the spirit, in the dark, It's like Sally Walker, sitting in the south. That's how you do it. Let's go and get on to it. Ride, Sally, ride. Put your hands on your hips. How about you ride with the spirit? With the spirit alive.
So much in the way of a Sunday service, in the music, in its role in setting up the preacher or setting up the church to invite, attend those in the congregation to join. Aretha gradually built the congregation, builds the song towards an ecstatic climax, which culminates with her dancing on stage, not in typical nightclub form, but basically in what is a Sunday morning stomp. Right now, here she's in the audience, but before she's up on stage stomping in what doesn't seem like any of the latest moves out of the 1970s, but would seem to echo and reverberate with the way in which the ring shout persisted under the terms of enslavement and evolved in the context of modern black churches across the 20th century, where she is stomping and shaking and moving back and forth, catching the spirit in the dark of the nightclub here. And so this song for me is emblematic of, again, the ways in which sacred and secular binaries are transgressed, crossing of lines around race, transgressing the typical boundaries as it relates to gender and sexuality. This performance is evocative of all that is apparent on a Sunday morning, but here being performed in the nightclub. Now, the difficulty, or the challenge here, well, it's a musical metaphor to think about the book as a whole. The book, again, is a story of the African American literary tradition. As I mentioned before, it begins with perhaps that most celebrated, that most chronicled moment in black cultural expression known as the Negro Renaissance, or the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, a culminating moment for a longer New Negro movement that began around the turn of the 20th century. And so here are just a few figures that center in the chapter. Of course, it's Alain Locke, Du Bois, and then Langston Hughes and George Schuyler, whose debate in 1926 in The Nation gave us Langston Hughes' classic essay, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, and George Schuyler's, to which Hughes was responding to George Schuyler's argument against the idea of a black art, the Negro art hokum. This is in June of 1926. God's Trombones, Jane Weldon Johnson's collection or interpretation of Negro sermons, that volume that Charles Spurgeon Johnson edited, Ebony and Topaz. The Fire quarterly for younger Negro artists, including figures like Wallace Thurman, Richard Bruce Nugent, Langston Hughes, Ornell Hurston, Arthur Huff Fawcett. And then the quintessential volume, Alain Locke's The New Negro, in the earlier issue of Survey Graphic. And in fact, the title of this book, the title of this chapter, comes from an essay that appeared in Survey Graphic that didn't make its way into Alain Locke's longer New Negro. The only essay in the shorter version that somehow didn't make it off the cutting room into the longer version, which included a whole bunch of new material. And part of the argument is that it doesn't fit with the telos that Locke is positing, right? Which is that race is somehow trumping the older commitments to religion, amongst other things that are apparent in black life. And so he's both making an interpretation in his foreword to the New Negro about how black life is emerging anew under the terms of migration, but he's positing that that's also a process of secularization. And so this essay, Church in the Negro Spirit, essay authored by George Edmund Haynes, the first black PhD from Columbia University, argues, in fact, that the evidence of that Negro spirit was most apparent in the institution of the Negro Church. It's a different vision of the relationship between race and religion that doesn't quite fit with the critique of Christianity that is apparent across several of Locke's writing in the New Negro. And so what the chapter tries to do is highlight the tensions between this racial spirit, as articulated by Locke and others, and the prominence of churches in a place like Harlem, right, where James Weldon Johnson in Black Manhattan would argue that about 90% of them could just shut down and it would save the race a whole host of energy. They're an unnecessary drain, and they in fact undermine the spiritual ambitions of the race. So what kind of spirit are Locke and James Weldon Johnson and others theorizing? Whereas in this debate between Schuyler and Hughes, both men point to the church, to black churches, but to make entirely different claims, right? Schuyler argues that black churches are largely evidence of white folk who want to be white, right? They share the same Bible, they pray to the same God. He refers to black churches as evidence that black folk are lamp-blacked Anglo-Saxons, right? He's, of course, a provocateur, a mentee of H.L. Mencken. He's making overstated claims to provoke an argument against the essentialist, what we think of as an essentialist notion of race. And then Hughes offers a class critique and appeals to the low-down storefront churches and says this is evidence of free black folk, right? And this may be the space where we finally see evidence of free black artists emerging. Within the church, churches are the low-down folk, right? So churches become a staging ground, and religion more broadly becomes a space in which race and modern black identity is theorized, and the tension between a church and a racial spirit. Moving forward, chapter on the 1930s largely centers around the debate and the fallout or arguments between Zora Neale Hurston on the top right and Richard Wright on the top left, on the bottom left. Of course, this is the decade that gives us her first and second novel, Jonah's Gourdvine, and then the more famous one, Their Eyes Are Watching God. And this is the decade before Richard Wright becomes the best-selling black author with Native Son and then Black Boy. And so before those, alongside a set of short stories published in what becomes Uncle Tom's Children, he writes an essay in Dorothy, the journal, New Challenge, edited by Dorothy West, entitled Blueprint for Negro Writing. Right? And much of what becomes later Zora Neale Hurston's folklore writings in the Sanctified Church first appear in this huge volume edited by the British heiress Nancy Cunard. Right? And you have two very distinctive claims about black life. One that sort of would echo the similar claims about black culture as pathological, as overdetermined by the scar of slavery. It sounds very much like early Chicago school sociology. Right? And that Richard Wright argues, in fact, that black culture was, in Blueprint for Negro Writing, that black culture continues to be constrained by the archaic morphology of Christian salvation, right? So these Christian categories that were imposed on black life under the terms of slavery continue to deform black life, but that if black writers are going to produce new myths to orient black life, they must be able to engage these forms to move black life forward. He's moving through Christianity, as he does in those short stories, to make a larger claim for class consciousness. Whereas Zora Neale Hurston, right, trained as an anthropologist, studying under Franz Boas at Columbia, is making what we now think of as a claim about African cultural retentions, right? That the legacies of Africa were still persisting, especially in the American South, where herself, as a daughter of a Baptist preacher, was witness to how these things took shape in the context of Southern black life, but also through her studies of the Caribbean. And so this debate over what both see as fluidity across lines of sacred secular shapes how they're thinking about, in Hurston's essay in particular, characteristics of Negro expression, and Richard Wright's claim for a blueprint for Negro writing over the idea of what we now think of as black literature in the 1930s. It's the question of this ancestral spirit, the presence or proximity of Africa and the Caribbean to black life in the United States. And so across the chronology, I'm trying to think through the various rubrics through which spirit is imagined. And the third chapter focuses especially on the 1940s. With the first beginning with the volume edited by Sterling Brown. Somehow I'm blanking on all these names I spent so much time with for so many years. Arthur Davis, I believe, Sterling Brown, Arthur Davis, and Ulysses, mistake his last name, a military historian. Arthur Davis, an English scholar, first Black English PhD from Columbia, and then the longtime Dean of Black Letters at Howard, Sterling Brown, give us the Negro Caravan, where they're making an argument for the Americanness of Black literature. But the chapter largely centers around Claude McKay. Right? Claude McKay, who had by this point fallen out of his networks, both within Black literary circles and as part of a broader leftist network, and towards the end of his life, finds solace within the traditions of the Catholic Church. He ends up in a Catholic settlement house, Friendship House, in Harlem, later moves to Chicago, and over this time converts to Catholicism, but also serves as a consultant to a Catholic bishop on race relations, Bishop Nick, McShiel, I want to say, and then also teaching, in fact, in what we now know of as the Catholic the CYO, right, Catholic Youth Organization. He's teaching classes within this Catholic social teaching space, as well as advising the bishop on race matters. He ends up in networks with the Catholic Workers Movement, on retreats with figures like Dorothy Day, but it's through Catholicism that it seems to me that he's attempting to reconcile what appears at this point to be the intractability of race, right? And in Negro Metropolis, one of his later books, although more recent, I guess in recent years, a novel was discovered by, in fact, a grad student faculty at Columbia that showed recent work that he did after Harlem Negro Metropolis. But Harlem Negro Metropolis was his own chronicle of Harlem shortly after the decline of the Harlem Renaissance, but it's also a claim about Black life more broadly. And in it, he pays the most amount of his attention to figures like Father Divine, Marcus Garvey, and Sufi Abdul Hamid, these figures who are both political leaders but religious leaders, and who stand outside of the establishment of Orthodox Christianity. And what he posits in there is largely commensurate with the ways in which Catholic alterity has been imagined, right? So he seems to see a similar difference in communities within sort of the larger Catholic Church and religious difference that makes Black culture distinctive in his account of Harlem Metropolis, which presents very real problems for the possibility of racial integration. And what's interesting in this chapter is the claims that are being made in Negro Caravan, as well as in Harlem Negro Metropolis. On one hand, that Black literature is Catholic in its use of universality. Black literature displays Catholicity, whereas the very real sense of Catholic alterity in Harlem Negro Metropolis is that both of these claims about Catholicity and Catholicism take shape in the moment in which, for the first time, the number of African Americans who are entering the Catholic Church is going to triple over the course of the 1940s. Right? So there's both the statistical entrance into Catholicism, but the very ways in which Catholicity and Catholicism shape the Black literary imagination converge during this period. Moving on, and again, as it should be apparent by now, right, these are all the usual suspects that show up on a typical African American literary survey. Right? Claude McKay, Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes. Here we have James Baldwin, we have Ralph Ellison, we have Ann Petrie, and then Robert Hayden, first Black library consultant to the Library of Congress, what we now think of as the Poet Laureate. And so part of the argument is that for us to narrate African American literature in the 20th century as secular requires looking away from the obvious, right? That much of this, there was archival work that went into finding this stuff, but it's also in most of the anthologized texts of Black literature. It's right there. But largely, whether by virtue of interest or the orthodoxies of literary departments, religion has not been. It's both everywhere and nowhere in terms of thinking about what moves the Black literary tradition forward. And so the way it worked here in this chapter, the discussion extends more about a claim about the universality of Black literature, discussion of the Black modernist novel and figures like Baldwin and Ellison. And religion shows up in different ways in this case, right? So we have Ann Petrie, who would be the sole African-American writer in Helen Hunt's 1950s Writers Book, which is a who's who of top writers in the American literary tradition, where she makes a claim, right, in arguing about a preoccupation in the midst of sort of thinking about McCarthy-era scare around the left, in the midst of this preoccupation or anxiety about a communist presence in the United States. She, in fact, argues that better attention ought to be paid less to the question of Marxism and its influence on writers and to Christianity, right? And in fact, what she argues is that what we see as the dominant theme in American literature can be reduced to a passage in the Hebrew Bible, emerging out of the story of Cain and Abel, am I my brother's keeper? So, right, about broader concern with social welfare, a broader concern with the critique of capitalism grows out of this fundamental Judeo-Christian ethos that has permeated American culture for the long haul. And whether that diverts attention over the sort of history of her own commitments on the left, or is to sort of make a claim sort of about the broader ethos of thinking about American literature, is not quite clear, right? But I think it works on both of those levels. And that's in 1950. That seems to have reversed itself. This is the first page of what will become The Fire Next Time, when it was first published in the New Yorker as Letter from a Region of My Mind, written by James Baldwin. And then we have Ralph Ellison's essay in the Saturday Review, As the Spirit Moves Mahalia. And we could think of, at the end of the 1950s into the 1960s, Baldwin's critique of the fundamental ties between Christianity and colonialism, about his acknowledgement of his temporary seduction with the Nation of Islam, right, which he later moves away from as an inversion of the logic of Christian white supremacy. But then also Ralph Ellison's claim about Mahalia Jackson, that fundamentally to understand her music, we must take seriously that she, more than anything else, sings so that the word might be heard, right? That it emerges out of the context, and he frames her as much as a blues singer as a ritual priestess. Right? To understand the full meaning of Mahalia's music, one must understand the claims about the word coming to life in the context of the black church. Right? She, in fact, in writing it after her historic performance with Duke Ellington at the Newport Jazz Festival, which critics described as a failure, he argued that, in fact, to hear Mahalia sing, one had to go to Newport's AME church that Sunday morning to really hear Mahalia sing the blues, or what we might think of as gospel. And then, outside the sort of parameters of this black Christian tradition, a figure like Robert Hayden is a great example of this. So while raised Baptist in Detroit in the 1940s, Hayden, along with his wife Irma, converts to join the American Baha'i community. Right? Where sort of most fundamental premise is that all religions are sort of paths. It's sort of, in some ways we could think of it as a longer extension of the Unitarian tradition, but it has its own roots in the Middle East, in Persia in particular. But this idea that all religions culminate with the same place and or culminate together, or lead different paths to the same place. And in 1948, we can see, as he's articulating an experimentalist aesthetic, we can see in this litany, in many ways, what would resemble a liturgy in the context of the Baha'i tradition. Right? So here, as it closes, and you can notice that there's no periodization here, so he's experimenting in form, but yet the substance of this, he argues, so it's against the chauvinistic, which is one of the critiques levied at the merging of sociology and politics as it informed debates around black literature. So he's critiquing the idea that black writing should be read in light of sociology and politics. And then he ends with, again, what sounds very much like a Baha'i confession of faith. We believe in the oneness of mankind in the importance of the arts in the struggle for peace and unity. It's a different spiritual tradition than these efforts to extend the aesthetics of Black church traditions like we might see in something like Go Tell It on the Mountain. James Baldwin brings to life the significance of Black churches on his own aesthetic vision and the cultural traditions that would stay with him long after he moved outside the theological claims of Christianity. And in many ways, the sort of culminating chapter that maybe gets the bulk of the attention is on the 1960s, that moment where that critique of Christianity as though white man's religion reaches a fevered pitch. And so what this chapter does is organize largely around three key anthologies of the time: Black Fire, edited by Larry Neal and Amiri Baraka, Tony Cade's The Black Woman, and Addison Gale's The Black Aesthetic, and looks at the ways in which religion shows up in three distinct ways, and often also tied, especially in the case of Black women, to thinking about gender, either in the form of a performance of a hypermasculinity. In fact, Black Fire begins with Amiri Baraka performing as Imamu, Amiri Baraka in the fashion of a Muslim cleric. But there's a different vision of religion as it shows up in the gender critique that appears in The Black Woman. And so we see religion on one hand as a critique of Christianity, but also a claim for a Black power version of Christianity. This is the decade that gives us Black liberation theology. This is the decade that would give us the Shrine of the Black Madonna, Albert Clegg, collection of sermons in 1968, The Black Messiah, so the theorizing of this idea of a Black Christian God. But then also an appeal to African-derived religions, right? This idea that African-derived religions, and not thinking about Islam on the continent, but what we now think of in the context of the Americas, traditions like Santeria and Candomblé, with their origins in places like Dahomey and Nigeria and Ghana, that these African-derived religious traditions are a source of authentic Black identity. On the left is Lorraine Hansberry speaking, giving a lecture at the first Negro Writers Conference. We think about these writers' conferences, places where Black solidarity was supported, theorized, and performed. And that, in fact, about 4 or 5 years later, I think at the third or fourth National Black Writers Conference at Fisk, it's there that Gwendolyn Brooks writes what by all counts sounds like a conversion experience. The process through which she went from becoming a Negro artist, Negro writer, to becoming a Black writer. So we can think about the ways in which Black power and the Black aesthetic, in fact, made a claim on how Black writers understood who they were in the world in ways that itself registered as a religious discourse. And then finally, chapter closes with a couple of writers, especially Albert Murray, who's on the left, the author of On the Americans, and Alice Walker, via her critique that she offers of one of the visions of one of the essays by James Stewart in Black Fire on this idea of a Black revolutionary artist. I call them contrary spirits simply that in that sense that their writing in large part at the time was pushing back against the orthodoxies of Black power, right? That imagined Christianity in a particular way, but also Christianity insofar as it lined up with a particular gender that privileged a Black masculine performance. And where in fact the book ends, and I'll just end with this image. This is Ishmael Reed, who himself is in many ways circulating through Black art, Black power arts and politics circles, but has a distinctive vision that he theorizes as the neo-hoodoo aesthetic. On the left, you see a short collection of poems published by Paul Bremen Press called Catechism of the Neo-American Hoodoo Church. And what's interesting here is that, in many regards, Ishmael Reed is issuing that critique of Christianity as the white man's religion. In his Neo-Hoodoo Manifesto, he refers to it as the cop religion, right? That Christianity is a form of policing. Yet also within that poem, he maps a sort of alternate spiritual geography that starts with botanicas in East Harlem that moves to the Heights District in San Francisco, that heads down through the southern, Black Baptist churches in the South, right? So it's not, in fact, Christianity as a set of theologies and doctrines, but he weaves the spiritual geography as a part of a larger critique of capitalism, of imperialism, of colonialism, of white supremacy. And yet still in theorizing it, he resorts to calling Neo-Hoodoo the church. So even in critique, even in dissent, he envisions a particular kind of church as the embodiment of this aesthetic. Neo-Hoodoo is a litany seeking its text. Neo-Hoodoo is a church finding its lyrics. And as we all know, we can't keep a good church down. So this is what the book tries to think through, right? The role of Afro-Protestantism in its persistence, even in critique, but also under this more robust genealogy of spirit, the multiple ways in which efforts to think through race brings up a diversity of religious traditions. So I will stop there, and I very much look forward to conversations, questions, critiques. Thank you for coming out. That was a whole lot. Yes.
So you mentioned that the Black Jewish poet that inspired you at the beginning of this story, and I was just curious, like, maybe this isn't relevant to your research at all, but how is, like, Judaism affect the thing that we're talking about?
Yeah. So it shows up in particular in the 1940s. So especially in one of the other books alongside Negro Caravan and Claude McKay's Negro Metropolis is a book called New World A-Coming by Roy Otley. First black war correspondent is how he became famous. Although later he accused of plagiarism for drawing on and not crediting a bunch of the work that a number of writers did in the New York chapter of the WPA. But in this, like Harlem Negro Metropolis, Roy Otley devotes most of the chapters to this book that is about black modern identity moving forward to a range of religious leaders, right? And so he gives significant attention to the local Harlem community of black Jews. I think it's Wentworth Matthews and the Commandment Keepers congregation that he focuses on. And on one hand, he argues that the black Jews out-Orthodox the white Jews, right, without using the sort of racial language. But then, so he argues that in their commitment to orthodoxy, the black Jews are, in fact, the more devout Jews, although by virtue of the race politics, they're not recognized as Jews as part of Jewish orthodoxy. And then at the same time, he moves beyond that in a way that I think reflects his own religious commitments. He was a longtime good friend of Adam Clayton Powell, was raised in Abyssinian Baptist Church, and had played in the youth basketball team there. And so he had his own set of Afro-Protestant commitments, but basically argues the language in his chapter on black Jewish communities in Harlem frames them in many ways as respectable Afro-Protestants, right? So it's through a Protestant language that he then makes a claim, and it's both a Protestant language, it's also a language around black middle-class respectability. So he's in that chapter, right? And it's interesting, too, that he's making a claim about black Judaism as both recognizable within a broader black Christian or black church culture, but that also is emblematic of commitments to the United States, of a sort of Americanness within black culture. And it's interesting that the year before his book comes out, he writes the most vicious, scathing review of Claude McKay's Harlem Negro Metropolis in the New York Times, right? Where McKay had hoped that Negro Metropolis would help can regain entree into the elite literary circles, this review, in effect, provides a lot of reason for that not to happen, we'll just say. But at the same time, it's clear, although he doesn't say as much in the review, that he's setting up his own argument about what the churches in Harlem mean for the prospects of Black equality in American society. Right? And so much of the claim, where McKay concludes at the end of Harlem Neighbor Metropolis, that the vitality and religious difference apparent in Black community is going to be a serious problem for inclusion. After thoroughly critiquing that idea, Otley makes a different set of claims that are apparent even in his discussion of Black Jews, right? That this is evidence of sort of middle-class respectability and commitments to American democracy. So religion then becomes a proxy for thinking about race, but also for thinking about American identity. Here and then here.
Thank you so much for your talk. I look forward to reading the book. I have a question about whether or not the authors that you examine, or whether the issues of the aesthetic and political consciousness come up, because I'm thinking about Their Eyes Were Watching God by Kirsten, Quicksand by Noah Larson, also Banjo by Bobby Kay, which I'm teaching right now, and the ways in which moments of ecstasy, right, whether they happen in a club or in church, are moments of liberation for many of those characters. But I can also see how, and I mean, I'm open to other interpretations of blueprint for Negro writing, but that I can also see that colliding with the materialism of rights argument in Blueprint for Negro writing.
Yeah.
And it also strikes me that in hearing your talk, that part of Baldwin's critique of right is that there's no transcendence in Native Son.
Interesting.
And that's part of the isolation in which Edward Thomas exists, because he's trapped in the material. Like, he has no community right that can overcome the political and economic circumstances in which he and his family live. So I would just love to hear you talk more about that, and again, I look forward to reading the book.
No, well, thank you. I think that's exactly right. I mean, clearly, to think about Wright's relationship in Blueprint to Black church, ambivalence at best, right? But there's a recognition that one has to grapple with the significance of, right? So it's not his profession of Christian faith in any, but an effort to grapple with and make a claim for moving beyond, right, the limits of those categories. And I very much would read Baldwin's critique, right, in his distancing himself, is that both him and Ellison, and I think of not in Everybody's Protest novel, but the other essay, The Notes of the Native Son, where Baldwin is suggesting that within Black literature, that there isn't a literary performance yet that seems to get at the vitality of Black cultural performances. And he's making a nod to Ellison as Invisible Man is coming out. It's to say that Black writers, and this is sort of the critique in Everybody's Protest novel, is that these caricatures and forms don't actually capture the cultural life that is apparent, that is it's overdetermined by these materialist structures. And so I think Ellison and Baldwin see themselves as trying to not erase the real pressing material realities, but try to think through the vitality and strength and survival that's apparent in Black cultural traditions. But I mean, I think so I'm obviously trying to argue against the prioritizing of that materialist critique, but I think Quicksand is the perfect example where you have that climactic moment, which looks like it's going to be liberation at the altar.
Right.
It is both very much sexualized, but then of course she ends up married to a preacher, and the idea of Christianity as it mounts onto a particular gender order confirms the way in which those material structures determine especially Black women's lives, right? So the possibility is very quickly, right? For a moment you might think the altar is going to be liberation, but then there's the rest of the story. Yeah, it's unresolved. And so part of what the larger argument is that we get more attention or more association with that, the second half, right, of the way in which Christianity aligns itself, in religion more broadly aligns itself with the oppressive social order. But more could be said about its role in the broader cultural vitality of Black life. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. I just was curious. I wasn't aware of that debate about the Black Jews in Harlem that you brought up earlier. And I thought it was interesting that the writer was saying that they were trying to be American. That made me think about kind of the links to Garveyism that Black Jews had. That so many of them were Caribbean, from the Caribbean, living in Harlem. There's so many people in Harlem.
Right.
So I was just thinking about, I got glimpses in your talk of kind of, I guess, Black aesthetic, not so contained within the U.S., but I was wondering kind of how that would change the dialogue around where Black is often with African Americans, that it can also mean.
Yeah. So the locus for my story is primarily a North American story, but in ways that attempts to account for. I mean, we can't talk about Black without talking about so many of them, as you mentioned, right? To think about what Harlem is standing in for the Black world, right? Because of migration, and this is in fact what Locke is appealing to the language of spirit, is to theorize Black folk converging upon each other from the Caribbean, from Africa, from the South. As it relates, I don't know if that even actually gets at the question, other than to acknowledge that yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think part of what I was suggesting in talking about the relationship between Black Judaism and Americanism is to look at the ways in which, across a variety of these traditions, there are national aspirations that are cultivated within these religious communities, right? And that's Roy Lotley's point, is that it's apparent that there is a claim for American citizenship, where Claude McKay is arguing something different. Obviously, the UNA has a very different way of imagining a Black nation. But then also, this is, I think, of James Melvin Washington's work on the Black Baptists, is to say that Black churches are, in fact, advancing earlier work around this idea of a nation within a nation, but that Black churches were, in fact, spaces where a nationalist sentiment was first cultivated. Right? And there's other scholars who think about the ways in which churches provided the space for a sense of Black collectivity to emerge even much earlier. So, there are different ways in which it discourse on citizenship, around nationhood, both in relationship to, but also in opposition to, at times, to the U.S. is across this literature. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for the work you've done. Just give us a snapshot of the book, but also to push back against presumed secularism and modernity. I think that's a huge undertaking to push back against secularism standing in for a kind of evolved sense of the modern, what it means to reinsert spirituality as part of that conversation, even in the midst of modernity. It makes it easy to follow us talk about postmodernity and holding on to spirituality in that context too. But I want to ask you more about this idea of racial aesthetics and what you mean. You give us a lot about it in the book. Basically, you talk about sort of the religious history of Black literature in a lot of ways, insisting on what I would see as almost religious aesthetics in another kind of history of Black literature, so what it means to think about it in those terms. So aesthetics beyond, it's kind of thinking out loud, but because I want to know what more you might say about aesthetics, but beyond a kind of assessment of the beautiful, that's probably the most surface level thinking about aesthetics, and not necessarily about arts and culture per se as the only way aesthetics is relevant, but as this kind of, what I call it art, they call it a science of sensory perception, but the art of science of sensory perception, what it means to approach the senses through the aesthetics as a way to approach our kind of sensory world, and what that means in the context of spirituality, especially when thinking about Spirit possession, getting back to Jennifer's question about the ecstatic, how it pushes us to think about our senses in a much broader way, think about other kinds of sensory perception, other ways of being in the body. And this idea of racial aesthetics is really exciting to me. I wanted to push a little bit more and see like what else, what other kinds of, not just a way of talking about kind of Black arts and culture, or racialized arts and culture, but also this kind of larger sensory universe and what it might mean to think about spirituality opening up a space for us to engage that larger sensory domain. So it sort of makes the religious studies questions relevant for sort of theoretical corporal ways of thinking about the body. And religion.
Absolutely. Wow. Yeah, that, I mean, I think that's exactly right. So I don't do much, in fact, work around theorizing racial aesthetics. It was more, so my struggle in this regard was trying to find a rubric under which to locate this debate, right? And so, because it could have been a religious history of Black aesthetics, but what I guess I say in the introduction is I adopt a rather layperson definite, hopefully in the Holy Black, which is more theoretically driven and less concerned with the chronology, there'll be more thinking about the categories of aesthetics, but and so sort of I use the language of racial aesthetics to, on one hand, highlight that the first efforts to think through, early efforts to think through Black literature often referred to as race literature, but that also that race literature was often imagined in relationship to a broader set of visual, musical performance, right? So I used both race on one hand to highlight, here thinking about Victoria Matthews' essay, The Value of Race Literature as one of the ways of thinking about the emergence of the category of race literature, and then aesthetics to highlight the way in which a story that I'm telling, which is largely centered around criticism, right? And so it's very much a literary story, was often attempting to theorize Black culture more broadly, right? And so most of the essays are by people who are identified as writers, although there's a piece by Romeo Bearden in there that he wrote in the 1950s, I believe. But I don't do a whole host of philosophical, theoretical work. But it is my turn to literature and to the arts more broadly is, I think, part of a broader movement of religious studies to think about religion through the body, through affect, through sound, right? Through a broader set of categories rather than belief or doctrine or orthodoxy, right? Which is right, the term from, say, theory to these forms of practice, right? And so, I mean, you can see that. I think that even debate or struggle is apparent in the literature in terms of how we think about how these writers are thinking about Black literature. So if you look at just as one example, you think about the debate that I mentioned to very quickly in passing in 1926 between George Schuyler and Langston Hughes, right? Which is about Black art, right? It's not about religion. But they both point to religion as one of the key places. And what does Schuyler do? He says, look at these churches, look at the Bibles they read, look at their theology, right? It's about text, it's about belief. And then Hughes says, no, you got it wrong. But I'm going to also point to churches, but it's about their dancing, their singing, their shouting. And so whether we think about what religion is, or whether we think about what the Black church is, are we talking about a set of doctrines, creeds, and dogma? Or are we talking about a set of practices, right? Are we talking about a set of moods and dispositions that are cultivated through embodied practices, right? And so I think, on one hand, my turn to these sources grows out of that shift or tension within religious studies, which is not unique to religious studies. But then I think it was something that these sources I felt were so significant for the field because that tension was in fact already apparent, right? And was at play in their arguments about how to describe Blackness, right? How to define Blackness, yeah.
Thank you for the talk and the overview. This is really intriguing. And I had one question before I got here off of reading your discussion of Aretha Franklin. Another one spurred by the last part of the book. But so the first question, So when I was reading that and then hearing you talk about it again and seeing her performance, I started thinking about D'Angelo a few years ago, who said, for him, how does it feel was very spiritual. It wasn't about sex, but also acknowledging how sex and sexuality is a central part of the church. But then when you bring up the Negro Artist from Racial Mountain, part of what Hughes is doing is also saying, you know, you gotta go to the blues club, you gotta go to the jazz club. So, wonder if you could just talk a bit more about that seeming contradiction. Like I teach a hip hop class and we were talking about the 5%ers, and so at one point, we basically say if I'm a religious figure, they were like, why would you be teaching a hip hop class? And so there's that question of, you know, this sense that we should separate one set of practices from our religious beliefs and spiritual practices. If you can talk a little bit more about how that plays out in the book. But the other thing that popped up, and this is really when you're talking about the Black Arts Movement, you mentioned Barack, but you also mentioned there's Noah Drabi and some other. So I'm wondering how Islam plays into this at an aesthetic level, or does it play into it as, even if in terms of those religious or Islamic form pronouncements, is there a different kind of spiritual aesthetic, or is it still drawing on this kind of Black church grounding that takes on a different articulation, but nonetheless reflects the same kind of sensibility?
No, that's a great question. I think maybe if I go in reverse order. I mean, I think, so in the Black, so to the role of Islam in the context of the 1960s, at least as in the book, most of the focus is on Islam as sort of marker of Blackness, but not as a different aesthetic. But I think to your larger question, I think what of the, right, and this is part of what it's like part of trying to think through is the way in which this religious diversity, a variety of religious communities and practices coexist within the context of Black life, right? And so I think within the context of Protestant Christianity, the language of ecumenism is to think about interdenominational difference mediated by a larger Christian, shared Christianity. And there's part of me, right, I think, I guess I wrote about this a little bit before the book, that race functions similarly, right? And so the sort of continuity of fluidity across these traditions, one of the jokes about like Louis Farrakhan as this figurehead from the Nation of Islam, that, you know, he's the best Black Baptist preacher you'll ever, right? So like the shared aesthetic practices that are, and I think this also goes back to that play between what is it that brings these traditions together or actually defines them. Is it a set of orthodoxies, or are the orthodoxies that abide across these communities within Black life something different that isn't quite named? It may not be named as, in fact, a way of being in the world, right? So I don't know if that answers that. I mean, it answers in the sense that I don't quite answer it in the book, right? I acknowledge that I don't quite answer the book that Islam largely figures, but that I think Blackness, within, especially in the context of the 60s, provides a space for these things to coexist. Yeah, so, and I think of here also, not in relation to Islam, but across the traditions, a variety of traditions. There's an essay, the essay that Alice Walker seems to be signifying on her critique of the revolutionary Black artist, James Stewart's theorizing, right? It's largely an essay, but towards the end, he shifts to a litany, and in the litany, I don't want to mess it up. Can I say that from here? But it's right, he just jumps across a set of traditions as a marker of Blackness or critique of whiteness. So towards the end of the essay, Stewart calls for a methodology affirmed by the Spirit, shifts from prose to verse and writes, that spirit is black, that spirit is non-white, that spirit is patois, that spirit is samba, voodoo, the Black Baptist Church in the South, right? So he moves from language to dance to what we think of as a discrete religious tradition, but then back to Christianity, Black Baptists, or maybe that's not actually Christian, in the way in which they're forming it. So, but that, and what's he's positing shared aesthetic across these, right? Across these, that is maybe something deeper than the professed commitments, right? That is not pre-language. The first question was about the coexistence. It was via Aretha, 5%, the sacred and the secular. Yeah. Can you restate for me?
There's this, just so that you have a read the kind of forming in the 9th. So the kind of common popular notion is that we should keep the secular realm kind of separate, our religious and spiritual separate from the secular.
Yep.
You seem to be suggesting with a read that they are inseparable.
Right.
D'Angelo makes the same thing. So I'm just wondering.
No, I got right. And I think right after, and this is part of what he later explains is why he left, right? Because, right, is that he's being reduced, received as such, even though he understands it as something different, because within the Pentecostal churches, there's a different relationship to the body, right? Even if the public language around the body is something very different, right? Where his performance would seem to be an affront to those Pentecostal holiness traditions, even if he's very much thinking through it in the context of the theology he learned there. Right, so, I think the meta question, which I take up more in the second book that was behind both of these projects in this, is about the relationship between sacred and secular. And I think it is related to this question, and I think this is where I thought Lyndon was pushing me earlier, is that, right, the relationship or opposition between belief and practice is seen as a subset of the relationship between sacred and secular, right? These beliefs are sacred, right? But those bodily things, and so the religious communities are often, there's a Christian community in particular, not, right? Other religious traditions have a different way of thinking about the body. But then Black religious traditions, Black Christianity in particular, would seem to be a problem for that kind of thinking. And so, and so folks will argue, well, that sacred secular distinction, that body spirit distinction is never held within Black communities, and that's part of what's distinctive of Black community. It even then becomes a sort of argument about the persistence of African culture, which I think was apparent in even how I was narrating Aretha. But I think less than sort of making that claim that this fluidity is sort of marker of the evidence of the persistence of African difference, is to think about even the way in which, in this literature, I think it is there, like the idea of sacred and secular, often, even when secularization theses were in vogue, right, which have since, right, they're no longer, obviously religion has gone nowhere, or it's gone all over the place, right, in all sorts of ways that we don't like, is that even in the context when secularization theses were in vogue, which generally were seen as being in their culminating moment around the 1960s, which is also, right, the moment where the book ends, Black folk were somehow understood as the foil, right? They're often imagined as the antidote, right? Black folk were going to provide cultural vitality to a fading West, right? That had lost its spiritual compass. But then, right, the claims about that sacred, secular, that religious vitality of the Black community are, by these writers, interpreted in very different terms, right? And I think you could see this even in something like the debate between Hurston and Richard Wright, right? So Hurston is making an argument, right, that all of these, right, in the characteristics of Negro expression, she starts talking about these folk heroes which resemble West African, like, making connections between High John the Conqueror and sort of West African trickster figures. And she basically is arguing, making an Africanist argument. And much of what Richard Wright talks about in his essay supports the idea of Black cultural distinctiveness and supports the idea of these sacred secular distinctions are not significant. But it's not because of Africa, it's because of white supremacy, right? It's segregation, in fact. Black churches right, don't abide by these sacred secular distinctions, not because of Africa, but because Black church has historically had to also be a dance hall, right? So whether I think their claim is very much, right, part of a longer genealogy of the relationship between sociology and anthropology, and whether we think about the structures or whether we think about sort of the agency of individuals. And so that how we interpret sacred and secular in the context of Black life is very much up for grabs. And so what I'm hoping to do is, through this particular story, but then through the follow-up, is call attention to how that binary actually doesn't tell us very little about the way in which Black cultural life is made. It doesn't tell us, the binaries just aren't the most helpful interpretive tools, but they are still so persistent, right? Like we appeal to them, especially as it relates to religion, I think in some ways. Like we have a very much, a much more, and I guess this goes back to the earlier Black Studies question, right? We have a very robust way of thinking about, I think it's Stuart Hall's essay, theorizing classic essay from the Black Popular Culture Conference, of thinking about Black culture as sort of never pure, right? And sort of think about, Gates is theorizing all Black texts are mulatto texts. We think of, right, all of the robust theories that we have of hybridization, creolization of Black life. And I think the same can be said as it relates to something like the Black church. But not necessarily, I'll stop there.
That's a follow-up question. Which is more a projection which may take you into the next project, of maybe things you're thinking about for this project. The things that are related to the project you never want to think about again, because I know how that is too. You think, okay, I'm done with this. But I was excited, thankful to you, and so thankful to you for claiming and having us take a look at Zorah Harrison as one of those ancestral spirits and the work that she does. I think you undercut yourself a little bit in terms of how you use Aretha and how she pushes us to think about, through her body, the kind of aesthetic questions, the importance of thinking of a larger framework for understanding these theories through both music, even though the text isn't necessarily about music, but it's helpful, pushes us intellectually to see her theorizing both through her body and through her song presentation, something that we can then look to literature to work through using a kind of religious lens. It's sort of doing a lot of heavy lifting in terms of interdisciplinarity. I think it's a beautiful model for all of us. But this idea of using Hurston then as a kind of to go from Hurston to Aretha, thinking about, okay, what is this ancestral spirit telling us about this relationship, going to Brent's question too, about pulling Blackness beyond the bounds of the United States, what it means to think about religious communities as she does, and inhabit those communities between the U.S. South and the Caribbean. And I wonder if moving forward, if there are, in time, if there are particular figures like, I suppose a Hurston theoretically, but I'm more excited about thinking sort of artistically, figures who you're thinking through maybe for the next project who are standing at that bound, like we were just talking about, on that threshold between the secular and the sacred, who are embodying that kind of example. He offers D'Angelo, which is a great example. But are there other folks who are doing that kind of work who could claim a Zorah or an Aretha as a kind of ancestral presence? Because they're also genre. Through genres, they're doing a lot of mixing of genres. So Zorah as a figure you mentioned too, so it's beautiful to take her as an exemplar of what it means to live in that interdisciplinarity. Are there other folks who you see more contemporarily doing that same kind of work? There are artists or theorists who are excited about, who are working that threshold?
Well, I mean, even in the book, right, Zora figures, for, like, she shows up, right, within Reed's Neohood, right? So she becomes an example or a priestess for him, and for many others during that point. So there, yeah, so the music, I mean, sorry, the second book does have a chapter on a group of writers in the 80s and early 90s who are under a variety of rubrics, thinking with Trey Ellis, his essay, The New Black Aesthetic, Greg Tate's CultNet Meets the Freaky Geek, which is sort of his effort to place the 60s in conversation with black rock and roll in the 1990s, 80s, when he's writing for the Village Voice. And so what on one hand, as well as in that section, Joe Wood's essay on Malcolm X as an iconic figure. So as it relates to Hurston, the closest in that group, I'm trying to think who else is in that set of, I'm right now finishing up cleaning up that chapter, but the closest would be someone like a Greg Tate, in the few folks. I mean, I think there are, I haven't, at least within my academic work, tried to make many more connections to the contemporary black art scene. But I mean, you could think of someone like Julie Dash's film work as an extension, and someone like Arthur Jaffa, who then also consults with Beyonce or her visual albums. So you can certainly see, and across that thread is a concern with Afro-diasporic religious spaces, right? So you think about all the efforts to think about, who was it, Yemaya, in visual, in Beyonce's album, or try to efforts to think of West African culture. So some of them are there. I haven't, my own work is taking a different trajectory, but Tate, in large part, he invokes the work of African art historian Robert Ferris Thompson in Yale, and it seems like a number of black writers at that time were engaging with Ferris Thompson to think through a conjuring tradition, right? Black writers as conjurers, that doesn't necessarily explicitly name Zora, but could be tracked through Reed to Zora through the 60s.
Okay, so I was really drawn to the language of the catechism of the Neo-Voodoo, and then was it McKay who you were talking about, like new connections to the Catholic Church?
Yes.
So like, and then us now like fleshing through West African spirituality. Like that's all becoming like very circular to me, and I was wondering if you found like, any intersections, and like just the fact that he was Neo-Voodooism, if I understood correctly, was making claims away from religion, but in the title clearly has connections to Catholicism. Yeah.
No, I mean, Ishmael Reed is interesting. I mean, so right. So one of, I mean, again, I do, especially in I guess it's chapter 3 and 4, I want to make a claim about Catholicism, which is often undertreated when thinking about black religion in the United States, right? It's often told as an Afro-Protestant story. And so Claude McKay is sort of exemplary of this, but there are others. As it relates to Ishmael Reed, he's so, on one hand, he's clearly appealing to, right, whether it be through catechism, whether through this appeal to church, but it's an anti-Christian church, but he also had a relationship with a black Catholic priest who I think led black studies at the University of Nebraska. I'm trying to think of his name, who also ended up being a headline in Ebony magazine because he decided he was no longer going to be a priest. He marries a woman and leaves the church, right? But that Reed I can't think of what the source was. He dedicates, in fact, Catholic one of the people to whom he dedicates catechism is to this, I think it's Father Ted, something or other. So on one hand, he's theorizing, but then he credits Father Ted as being part of the loyal resistance and for help, like he gives him credit for helping him think through something. I guess they met when Reed was speaking in Nebraska, from what I can recall. So there's also a very practical connection. And I think it's similar, although what's similar between him and McKay is that they seem to both be engaging Catholicism on at least two different levels, but to two very different ends, right? So there's both the practical connection of this priest who was helpful to him at some point, but then there's also the theoretical where he's using the category associated with Catholicism to think through his own anti-church aesthetic. Whereas with McKay, right, he's on one hand thinking about similarities between Black cultural difference and what is thought of as Catholic difference, but then he's also circulating within a set of cultural networks. And so there's both the practical connections that facilitate or grant access to the language of the church. But for McKay, he then ultimately seems to find also solace in the sort of mysticism and sort of the theology of the church universal, right? This idea, right? So this idea for an institution and hope for an institution that could care for all, right? And it did, in fact. The Catholic Church was a space that cared for him. So there's both the practical level and the level of ideation, but to very, very different ends. So I don't know which of those is real Catholicism.
I always find it's like Catholicism is a very tricky theology. Like it can be taken to one extreme where it can be revamped, like to your own understanding. So.
And I think it's
a very weighty tradition.
Absolutely, and that's also, I mean, as it related to your point around, I think African derived religious traditions, right? We think about sort of histories of Catholic versus Protestant colonialism,
right.
But that Catholicism is also often described as providing a set of categories of theology through which African spirits were more readily maintained. But what also I think across, and this is what I am trying to spend a little more time clarifying in the second book, and that I don't do as much in the first one, is that there's a way in which religious orthodoxy and racial authenticity like travel alongside each other and are co-mingling, and it's not quite clear all the time where, right, an appeal to orthodoxy could be seen to undermine a claim for racial authenticity or could be evidence for. And so part of what I'm trying to do is think through the relationship between religious authenticity and religious orthodoxy and racial authenticity in a space that in which sort of Protestant Christianity is the hegemonic religious tradition that finds a way of persisting, but not necessarily or never quite actually stamping out the rest, even if that's been the ambition, and trying to offer an account for how that happens. Yeah, that's a great question.
If you don't have any more questions lingering, join me in thanking again Dr. Sorett.